A single Roman legion could conquer and hold territory for centuries. This video will reveal the brutal training system that built history's most efficient military machine. You will gain a complete blueprint for organizational power that still influences the world today. How did they turn farmers into unbreakable soldiers? And what was the dark psychological price of such perfect discipline? What does it truly take to build something that lasts 1,000 years? That single legion, a permanent fixture on the frontier, was the product of a profound revolution. Before the professional soldier, there was the citizen who owned a plot of land. For centuries, Rome's strength came from men who would farm in spring and summer, then take up their own arms to fight in autumn campaigns. Their loyalty was to their property and their community first, but an empire cannot be built on a seasonal schedule. The turning point arrived with a man named Gaius Marius and a series of changes in the year 107 before the Common Era. What became known as the Marian Reforms did something radical. It threw the army's doors open to every Roman citizen, regardless of wealth or land ownership. Suddenly, military service was not a duty tied to your farm. It was a career, a lifeline, and a promise. The state would provide the weapons, the regular pay, and crucially, the prospect of a pension in the form of a land grant upon retirement. This created an entirely new kind of human being in the ancient world, the professional legionary. His food, his future, his very identity were now woven into the fabric of the Roman state. This dependency forged a loyalty more powerful than any temporary allegiance. A soldier no longer rushed home for the harvest, he stayed in camp year after year. And with that permanence came the most valuable resource of all, time. Time to train not as a militia, but as a unified machine. The farmer soldier was a tool you borrowed. The professional legionary was an instrument you owned, and you could spend years perfecting its use. This was the essential, quiet foundation upon which the brutal efficiency of the legions would be built. Without this shift from citizen to careerist, the legendary training that followed would have been impossible. The stage was now set, and the real forging was about to begin. The professional soldier now had a home, but it was a home designed for a single purpose. That home was the legionary fortress, a masterpiece of engineering and psychological conditioning. Before a new recruit ever faced an enemy on the battlefield, his entire world was reshaped by the walls, streets, and relentless routine of the permanent camp. These fortresses were not just defensive positions, they were cities of war, built to an identical blueprint from the damp mists of Britannia to the scorching sands of Syria. Stepping into one was stepping into a machine. Every street ran at a perfect right angle. Every barracks block housed the same number of men in the same cramped conditions, and the headquarters building always stood at the exact center. This uniformity was not an accident of efficiency. It was the first and most profound lesson in discipline. A soldier transferred from one end of the empire to the other would know instantly where to find his quarters, his unit's shrine, and the latrines. The chaos of the outside world was locked beyond the gates, replaced by a predictable, regulated order. Life within those walls was a symphony of controlled movement, conducted by the sound of trumpets and drums. A soldier's day began not with the sun, but with a specific signal. He marched to meals, to training, and to work details in precise formations. He was responsible for maintaining his section of the rampart, for keeping his bunk and gear spotless, and for participating in the endless construction and repair that kept the fortress self-sufficient. The historian Josephus, who witnessed these camps firsthand, famously wrote that they appeared so orderly they seemed like a city built in an instant. This constant activity served a deeper purpose than mere busywork. It instilled a rhythm of obedience where individual choice was replaced by collective response. The camp itself was the ultimate training tool, a crucible that burned away a recruit's civilian identity. In this environment, a man from a Gallic farm and a man from an Italian town learned to move, eat, sleep, and think as one. They became interchangeable components in a system far greater than themselves, mentally prepared for the even stricter demands of combat. The fortress did not just house the Legion, it was the Legion in stone and timber and daily habit. Within those fortress walls, the first and most brutal lesson was not about fighting, but about walking. Before a recruit ever held a gladius, he learned the tyranny of the march. This was the foundational principle of Roman power, a simple, grueling task that forged the empire's strategic backbone. A legionary's primary skill was measured not in sword strokes, but in miles covered under a crushing load. The standard was almost inhuman, a forced route march of 20 Roman miles, completed in just 5 hours while carrying a pack that could weigh over 60 pounds. This was the military step, a pace that blended speed with relentless, grinding endurance. Think of that weight, the equivalent of carrying a large sack of concrete across hills, through mud, and under a blazing sun, all while maintaining the exact spacing in your unit. The purpose was twofold: to build physical resilience that bordered on the superhuman, and to erase the very concept of individual hardship. When every man in the century is suffering the same burning shoulders and aching legs, your personal struggle dissolves into a shared, collective burden. You stop thinking about your own pain and start focusing on keeping pace with the man in front of you. This is where unit cohesion was born, not in speeches, but in shared exhaustion. But the drill did not end when the miles were done. At the end of each grueling march, the soldiers were required to construct a full, fortified camp from scratch. Every man had a specific task, from digging the perimeter trench to raising the earthen rampart and planting the sharpened stakes. They performed this labor until it became a precise, wordless ritual, a second nature honed by endless repetition. The message was seared into their muscles and minds: movement must always be followed by security, advance must always be paired with discipline. This constant cycle, march and build, transformed an army from a mere collection of fighters into a self-contained, mobile fortress. It granted the legions a strategic mobility that terrified their opponents. While other armies moved slowly, bogged down by baggage trains and disorder, a Roman legion could cover vast distances at a steady, shocking pace and be fully protected by nightfall. This ability to appear where they were least expected, fresh and secure behind their own walls, was a psychological weapon as potent as any sword. Mastery of this simple, exhausting task was the non-negotiable bedrock. Without the march, there was no mobility; without the camp, there was no safety; and without both, there was no Roman Empire. The relentless march forged their bodies, but the true weapon was forged in the training yard. Here, under the watchful eyes of veteran centurions, a recruit encountered the second principle of Roman efficiency, the weight of wood. Before he was ever trusted with the lethal edge of a gladius, his hands were wrapped around a heavy wooden practice sword, the rudis, and he hefted a wicker shield that weighed twice as much as the standard battle scutum. His opponent was not a man, but a solid wooden post driven deep into the earth, the palace. For hours each day, the air filled with the rhythmic thud of wood against wood, as recruits practiced the same motion over and over, the short, powerful thrust. This was not about learning fancy swordplay, it was about erasing thought from combat. The goal was to make that single, lethal movement so deeply ingrained in muscle memory that in the chaos of battle, the body would react before the mind could panic. The Roman legionary did not waste energy on wide, dramatic slashes. He aimed for the tight spaces between an enemy's ribs, for the throat, for the face. The thrust was faster, required less room, and was far more likely to be fatal. By overloading the recruit's arms and shoulders with these deliberately heavy tools, The Centurions were building a specific kind of strength, the endurance to deliver that precise killing blow dozens, even hundreds of times without the arm failing. The military writer Vegetius noted this method was designed so that recruits could be exercised with the wooden foils and wicker targets, so that they may receive no hurt. The genius was in the contrast. After months of straining against the weight of the wooden rudies, the recruit was finally handed his issued gladius. The real weapon, made of sharpened steel, felt astonishingly light and swift in his hand. What had once been a laborious movement now felt effortless, a flick of the wrist. The wooden post had taught his muscles the path, and the heavy shield had built the strength to hold the line. Now the real sword became a natural extension of his own body. In the press of the shield wall, surrounded by noise and fear, his training took over. He did not choose to thrust. His body simply performed the action it had repeated 10,000 times. This was the brutal calculus of Roman training, to replace the uncertainty of a fighter's instinct with the certainty of a machine's repetition. The palace post, scarred and dented by countless practice blows, stood as a silent teacher. It asked for nothing but patience and sweat, and in return, it promised a simple, terrible efficiency on the day it mattered most. But mastering the sword and the march was only half the equation. A lone soldier, no matter how skilled, was just a man. The Roman legion's true power emerged only when those men moved together, and for that, they needed a language of motion more complex than any spoken word. This was the third principle, formation as fortress. Individual prowess was deliberately sacrificed at the altar of group coordination. In the training yard, recruits drilled incessantly in complex battlefield maneuvers, learning to shift from one formation to another as fluidly as breathing. They began with the older manipular system, a flexible checkerboard of small units that could advance, retreat, and support one another like pieces on a game board. This taught them spacing and mutual dependence, but the heart of the Imperial Legion was the cohort, a block of roughly 480 men that formed a solid, unbreakable line. The drill was to transition from that open checkerboard into the dense, unified wall of the cohort on a single command, a feat that required every man to know his exact place in the geometric puzzle. The most iconic expression of this collective discipline was the testudo, the tortoise formation. At the bellow of an officer, ranks would seamlessly merge, the front line locking their large rectangular shields edge to form a wall. The men behind would raise their shields overhead, angling them to create a protective roof of overlapping wood and leather. In moments, a vulnerable mass of individuals transformed into a slow, methodical, moving fortress, nearly impervious to arrows and stones. They practiced this under simulated attack, with instructors hurling dummy projectiles to test for gaps. The goal was never to think, only to react. Every maneuver was tied to specific trumpet calls and shouted commands, drilled until the response was an unconscious reflex in every soldier's bones. The unit had to move as a single organism, a collective entity where the shield of the man to your left was as vital as the sword in your own hand. This relentless, synchronized drilling accomplished something profound. It eliminated the paralysis of fear. In the chaos of battle, a soldier did not have to wonder what to do. He simply listened for the familiar signal, and his body, trained by thousands of repetitions, fell into the practiced pattern. The formation itself became his weapon and his shelter. This was the ultimate alchemy of Roman training, turning the volatile element of human courage into the stable, predictable compound of disciplined motion. The Legion did not just fight as a group, it thought as one, a single mind distributed across thousands of bodies, and that made it nearly unstoppable. Yet the shield wall and the practice post were only the beginning of the soldiers' education. For the veterans and the centurions who led them, there existed a higher discipline, a secret language of movement known as the Armatura. This was not basic drill, it was the choreography of combat itself, an advanced martial art practiced by Rome's professional warriors. Think of it as a complex, flowing sequence, a series of armed and unarmed maneuvers performed against imaginary opponents. A soldier practicing the Armatura would move through a precise pattern of strikes, parries, feints, and evasions, simulating a fight against multiple adversaries from different angles. It demanded not just strength but a dancer's agility, a perfect sense of balance, and split-second timing. The wooden rudies became an extension of his intent, weaving through the air in practiced arcs that blocked a high attack, disengaged, and thrust low in one continuous motion. This was where fighting skill was elevated from simple repetition to an intelligent art form. The Armatura was both physical conditioning and a demonstration of martial virtue, a performance of lethal grace. Veterans would often execute these sequences before their commanders, not as a spectacle, but as proof of their readiness and their deep internalization of the legion's way of war. The true value, however, was revealed in the chaos of actual battle, when the orderly lines inevitably broke down into a swirling, confused melee. A soldier trained in the Armatura did not freeze. His body knew how to flow from one defensive posture to another, how to use his shield not just as a wall but as an active tool for deflection and control, and how to make every movement count. It granted a fluid adaptability that turned the Roman fighting style from a blunt instrument into a sharp, responsive one. While the recruit learned to be a solid brick in the fortress wall, the veteran through the Armatura learned how to remain a formidable, thinking warrior even when that wall temporarily crumbled around him. This high-level practice ensured the legion's backbone, its centurions and front-rank fighters could think with their bodies, reacting to unpredictability with a refined, automatic intelligence. The empire was not just built on brute force, but on this layered mastery where every level of soldier possessed a toolset matching his role, from the collective drill of the many to the sophisticated, individual art of the few. But the legion's discipline extended far beyond the practice yard and the battlefield. It was etched directly into the earth itself. A Roman soldier was not just a fighter, he was an engineer, a builder, and a laborer. His training was incomplete without mastering the art of construction, and for this, his most trusted companion was not his sword, but a heavy, dual-purpose tool called the Dolabra. Part axe, part pickaxe, this implement was as essential to his kit as his shield. With it, he could chop wood, break stone, and most importantly, dig. The ability to rapidly alter the landscape was not a secondary skill. It was a core component of Roman military doctrine, a strategic weapon as vital as any formation. Every time a legion halted for the night, the soldiers did not simply rest, they built. They transformed empty ground into a meticulously surveyed, fully fortified camp with a deep perimeter ditch and a sharpened palisade, all completed in a matter of hours. This was not busy work, it was a profound exercise in collective discipline. The physical labor under the open sky, swinging the Dolabra alongside your comrades, built a toughness that pure combat drill could not replicate. It fostered practical, on-the-spot problem-solving, as centurions directed teams to handle rocky soil, marshy ground, or steep inclines. More than anything, it created a tangible, shared accomplishment. At the end of an exhausting march, the men could look upon the ramparts they had raised together and see the immediate, physical proof of their collective effort. This constant cycle of movement and construction meant the army was never idle, its energy always channeled into productive, unifying tasks, but the scale of their engineering ambition went far beyond overnight camps. Legions built the permanent roads that stitched the empire together, laying stone highways that allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. They threw bridges across raging rivers, opening paths where nature intended none. In siege warfare, their skill became terrifyingly apparent, as they constructed massive earthen ramps, complex wooden towers, and tunnels to undermine city walls. This capability made the Roman military utterly self-sufficient. A hostile landscape was not a barrier, it was merely a problem to be solved with coordinated labor. A river could be crossed, a forest could be cleared for a road, and a mountain pass could be made secure. This transformed the legion from a mere force of conquest into an enduring instrument of consolidation. Where they marched, infrastructure followed, binding newly claimed territory permanently to Rome. The soldier with his Dolabra was not just conquering land, he was literally building the empire, one ditch, one road, and one fortress at a time, and in doing so, he forged an unbreakable bond with the very earth he was ordered to hold. The Dolabra built fortresses, but the legion's true strength was built in the mind of every soldier. This intangible force had a name, Disciplina, a concept so central it was worshipped as a divine virtue. Disciplina was not mere obedience, it was the very soul of the legion, a complete mental and moral framework that bound thousands of men into a single, unbreakable will. It was forged through a system of absolute clarity, where every action had a defined consequence, stretching from the darkest punishment to the brightest reward. At its most severe, this system could invoke a sanction so terrible its very name echoed through history: decimation. This was the ultimate penalty for a unit that had shown cowardice or mutiny. The condemned cohort would be divided by lot, and every 10th man, regardless of rank or prior bravery, would be clubbed or stoned to death by his own comrades. The remaining 9 would be forced to camp outside the fortress walls and survive on barley instead of wheat, a mark of disgrace that lived with them forever. The purpose of this ritual was not just to punish, but to rebuild collective responsibility through shared trauma. It made the price of failure unbearably personal for every single soldier, tying his survival directly to the courage and discipline of the man standing beside him. Yet for every shadow of fear, there was a powerful light of incentive. Disciplina was a balanced equation. The Roman state provided what no other ancient power reliably offered: a professional career with tangible benefits. A legionary received regular, documented pay, a portion of any plunder from successful campaigns, and the ultimate promise, a grant of land upon honorable retirement after 25 years of service. This was the carrot that made the stick bearable. A common soldier could realistically dream of retiring as a landowner, a respected veteran with a secure future. This system expertly channeled raw ambition and self-interest into loyal service. A man fought not just for an abstract idea of Rome, but for his own share of silver, for his cut of the spoils, and for the farm that awaited him in a peaceful province. His personal fortune was inextricably linked to the success of his legion. The result was a profound psychological shift. Within this rigid framework, a soldier's primary loyalty crystallized around his immediate unit, his century, and his cohort. These were the men he marched with, built camps with, and whose performance directly impacted his own pay, his safety, and his honor. Fear of the enemy became secondary to the fear of failing these brothers in arms, of being the weak link that brought disgrace upon the group. Honor was no longer a vague ideal. It was a practical currency measured in shared hardship and collective triumph. This mindset, this disciplina, created a soldier who would hold the line not because a general was watching, but because the man to his left and right were depending on him. The fortress of the mind, built on this intricate blend of dread and hope, proved far more durable than any wall of stone. It was the final, essential ingredient that transformed a well-trained individual into a permanent component of history's most resilient machine. Disciplina lived in the heart of the legion, but it was enforced by the hands of a single man. This figure stood apart on the parade ground, instantly recognizable by the transverse crest of his helmet and the vine-wood staff he carried not as a walking aid, but as a symbol of his absolute authority. The Centurion was the living, breathing engine of the Roman military machine, the essential link between the grand strategy of generals and the grit of the common soldier. He was almost always a veteran who had risen through the ranks, a man who had endured every march, every training drill, and every battle he now commanded. His promotion was not a gift, it was a brutal meritocracy earned through proven courage and an intimate understanding of the legion's soul. He did not lead from a safe distance. He lived in the same barracks as his men, ate the same rations, and in battle, he took his position not behind the lines, but at the very front right of his century's formation. His was the first shield the enemy would strike, a fact that commanded a respect no order could ever instill. This proximity meant he knew his soldiers not as numbers, but as individuals. He memorized their faces, their names, their quirks, and most importantly, their capabilities. He knew which man had the endurance for a forced march, which recruit struggled with the sword thrust, and which veteran could be relied upon to steady the line when pressure mounted. This personal knowledge made his command terrifyingly efficient. His famous vine staff, the Vitus, was a constant presence. With it, he could deliver a sharp, stinging correction to a soldier who fell out of step or whose shield was held at a sloppy angle. This immediate, physical feedback was the language of the training yard, a non-lethal but painful reminder of the standards required. The Centurion's authority was both absolute and deeply personal, a combination that transformed the abstract concept of discipline into a daily, tangible reality for every man under his command. He was the translator of orders, taking the broad directives from the legate and converting them into the specific, actionable tasks for his century of 80 men. A command to fortify a position became detailed instructions on who dug the ditch, who cut the stakes, and who patrolled the perimeter. He did not just transmit instructions, he ensured they were understood and executed with a relentless zeal, because his own reputation and survival depended entirely on the performance of his unit. In this way, the Centurion formed the unbreakable backbone of the Legion. These were the professional non-commissioned officers who provided stability and continuity through decades of service, long after generals and emperors had come and gone. They embodied the Legion's ethos in their scarred hands and stern demeanor, making the machine function not through blind obedience, but through a hard-earned personal authority that every legionary, deep down, relied upon to survive. The Centurion's vine staff could enforce discipline, but it could not fuel a march. The true power of the Legion was measured in calories. The Roman military operated on a fundamental, almost modern understanding that an army marches on its stomach. Their genius was not just in training the soldier, but in systematically fueling the human machine, turning simple rations into a strategic advantage that few enemies could match. At the heart of this system was the daily grain ration, typically 2 to 3 pounds of hard wheat. This was not issued as bread, but as whole grain, placing the first task of the day directly into the soldier's own hands. Before dawn, the sound of grinding stones would echo through the barracks as each man processed his portion into coarse flour. This simple, mandatory act was a lesson in self-reliance, a daily ritual that connected the soldier directly to his most basic source of strength. He would then bake the flour into hardtack biscuits or, more commonly, cook it into a thick porridge called pulse. This staple was bland but incredibly efficient, a dense packet of carbohydrates designed to release energy slowly over hours of grueling labor. To this base, the state added vital supplements, strips of preserved bacon, hard cheese, lentils, onions, and whatever local vegetables could be foraged or requisitioned. The most famous beverage was posca, a mixture of sour wine vinegar and water. Far from a luxury, it was a practical necessity. The acidity helped mask the taste of questionable water and may have had mild antiseptic qualities, reducing the risk of illness on campaign. This carefully calibrated diet was engineered for one purpose: to produce sustained physical output. It was high in energy, reasonably balanced, and crucially highly portable and durable. The grain, bacon, and cheese could survive long marches in all weather, making the Legionary independent of fragile supply chains for days at a time. But the real magic was in the combination, the relentless physical conditioning of marching and construction, fueled by this steady, reliable intake of calories. It sculpted a specific type of physique, not the bulging muscles of a gladiator, but the lean, wiry endurance of a marathoner combined with the functional strength of a laborer. A Roman soldier could carry his 60-pound pack for 20 miles, then dig a trench for 2 hours and still have the energy to stand watch, all on a bowl of porridge and some salted meat. This physical resilience, born from diet as much as drill, gave the legions a staggering operational tempo. They could campaign longer, march farther, and recover faster than nearly any opponent. While a tribal army might rely on sporadic feasting or plunder, leading to feast or famine cycles that sapped morale and strength, the Roman system provided monotonous but guaranteed sustenance. This consistency was a logistical triumph that spoke of immense organizational depth. The ability to move, store, and distribute thousands of tons of grain across continents to ensure that even a legion besieging a remote desert fortress received its daily measure of wheat was a silent weapon. It meant the machine never starved, never grew weak from hunger, and never had to break off a campaign simply to find food. The enemy often saw only the shield wall and the gladius, but the empire's foundation was built on countless sacks of grain, endless wheels of cheese, and the daily grind of a soldier's hand against the millstone, turning his ration into the relentless energy that conquered the world. The relentless rhythm of daily drill forged perfect soldiers, but a perfect soldier can still falter in the chaos of a real fight. To bridge that final, terrifying gap, the legions invented controlled chaos. They staged massive, full-scale mock battles where the line between training and warfare deliberately blurred. These were not simple sparring matches. They were elaborate war games, sometimes called ludicrum pugni, the play of battle. Entire cohorts, hundreds of men at a time, would maneuver against each other across open fields, using blunted spears and wooden swords. The air would fill with the thunder of thousands of feet, the crash of practice shields, and the shouted commands of centurions trying to be heard over the din. The goal was to simulate the fog of war, that overwhelming confusion where plans collapse and instinct must take over. In these exercises, a soldier learned to find his place in the formation not on a silent parade ground, but while being jostled by friendly and simulated enemy troops, with dust in his eyes and deafening noise all around. It tested everything: the clarity of trumpet signals over distance, the ability of junior officers to adapt on the fly, and most importantly, the unspoken trust that your century would hold its shape under pressure. This was where drilled movements met unpredictable reality, forging a cohesion that was flexible, not brittle. This cultural obsession with martial games extended to the highest levels of Roman society in a spectacular ritual known as the Lusus Troia, the Troy Game. This was not training for the common legionary, but a breathtaking display performed by the sons of aristocratic families on horseback. It involved complex, ritualized maneuvers, weaving intricate patterns at full gallop, throwing javelins at targets, and demonstrating feats of agility that mirrored the demands of cavalry combat. While separate from the legion's grind, the Troy Game reflects the same core principle, that preparation for war should be woven into the very fabric of life, elevated to an art form. It emphasized precision, coordination, and fearless control at high speed, virtues any commander would desire. Together, the common soldier's mock battle and the aristocrat's ritual game served the same ultimate purpose for Rome. They turned the unpredictable terror of combat into a practiced performance. By normalizing chaos in training, they removed its power to paralyze. When a legionary finally faced a real enemy, the screaming, the confusion, the pressure, it felt familiar. It felt like just another exercise, albeit one with ultimate stakes. This psychological conditioning was the final polish on the weapon. The army did not just learn to fight, it learned to thrive in the very environment designed to break lesser forces. A walled city represented the ultimate challenge, a fortress designed to defy armies for years. Yet for a Roman legion, it was merely another engineering problem to be solved with methodical, rehearsed precision. Their approach to siege warfare was not born of frantic improvisation, but of relentless, standardized training. Before a single stone was thrown, every soldier knew his role in a terrifyingly efficient process that transformed the legion from a fighting force into a mobile factory for demolition. At the heart of this system was the Agger, the colossal siege ramp. Constructing one was a masterpiece of coordinated labor, practiced in drills until the movements were automatic. Legionaries would advance under cover of large, wheeled sheds called vinia to protect them from arrows and stones, while they dug a complex network of approach trenches. The earth from these trenches was then used to build the ramp itself, a sloping mountain of soil, timber, and rubble, inched forward day by day until it reached the enemy's walls. This was not a chaotic mob with shovels, it was a disciplined, rotating workforce. Some men dug, others carried baskets of earth, others defended the workers, and all of it was directed by centurions using measured signals. They practiced assembling the components of movable siege towers, multi-story wooden giants sheathed in wet hides to resist fire, which would be rolled up the completed ramp to disgorge soldiers directly onto the battlements. Alongside this physical construction, specialized crews trained on the legion's artillery, the ballistae and onagers. These were not simple catapults, they were precision instruments of torsion engineering. The ballistae, giant crossbows, could hurl heavy bolts with terrifying accuracy to clear defenders from the walls. The onager, named for the kick of a wild donkey, flung massive stones in a high arc to smash masonry and morale. Crews drilled endlessly on the mathematics of range and elevation, on the swift winding of the sinew ropes, and on rapid reloading under simulated attack. This engineering focus turned the slow, bloody gamble of a siege into a predictable, almost clinical operation. A Roman army arriving outside a city did not just surround it and hope for starvation or treachery, though those were always options. It immediately began reshaping the landscape, a visible, daily declaration of inevitable victory. The defenders would watch, helpless, as a new, artificial hill grew steadily toward them, a literal mountain of Roman willpower rising from the plain. The sound of thousands of digging tools, the creak of wooden towers being assembled, and the periodic thwack of a ballista bolt embedding itself in a parapet, these were psychological weapons as potent as any assault. The message was clear: your walls are not a sanctuary, they are merely a delay. Your fate is not a question of if, but of when. This systematic, rehearsed approach to overcoming fortifications meant that few places in the known world could truly be considered safe from Rome's reach. The legion's greatest strength was this ability to manufacture its own advantage anywhere, turning any patch of ground into a construction site for conquest. The legion's engineering genius and rehearsed sieges showcased a system confident in its own methods, yet this confidence never hardened into arrogance. A deeper secret to Rome's enduring military dominance was its remarkable ability to learn, to absorb the very strengths of the enemies it defeated. The Roman military machine was not a closed, perfected design. It was a living, adaptive organism that evolved through a pragmatic and relentless process of imitation. This intellectual flexibility became its ultimate strategic weapon, allowing it to incorporate the best ideas from across the known world into a single, ever-improving instrument of war. Consider the legionary's most iconic tool, the gladius. This short, double-edged sword was not a native Roman invention. Its design was adopted and refined after bitter experience fighting Iberian tribes in what is now Spain, where Roman soldiers witnessed the devastating effectiveness of the shorter, stabbing swords used by local warriors. The Romans saw a superior tool, stripped away any cultural pride, and made it their own, perfecting its use through the brutal training on the wooden post. The result was a weapon that defined an empire's way of fighting for centuries. This pattern repeated constantly. Early Roman cavalry was often an afterthought, but disastrous encounters with incredibly skilled horsemen, like the nimble Numidians of North Africa or the powerful cataphracts of the Parthian Empire, forced a painful re-evaluation. Rome responded not by dismissing these threats, but by studying them. They integrated allied cavalry from these very regions into their own forces, creating specialized auxiliary wings that could match enemy tactics on their own terms. The famous Roman pilum, the heavy javelin, may itself have been influenced by similar weapons used by Italic peoples. This adaptive mindset extended to the very composition of the army. The legions formed the heavy infantry corps, but Rome's reach was multiplied by the auxilia, regiments recruited from conquered or allied provinces. These units were not second-class troops. They were specialists who brought their homeland's martial traditions into the Roman fold. When the army needed expert archers, it turned to men from Crete whose skill with the bow was legendary. When it needed relentless, long-range skirmishers, it recruited slingers from the Balearic Islands who could hurl stones with enough force to fracture bone. These auxiliaries fought alongside the legions, their unique abilities filling gaps in the Roman tactical system and allowing the entire army to operate with a flexibility no single culture could muster. This pragmatic lack of pride created a hybrid military culture, a constantly updated playbook written with the blood and insight of 100 different peoples. A Roman commander facing a new foe did not simply rely on old manuals. He observed, he adapted, and he integrated. The enemy's successful tactic on Tuesday could be dissected, practiced in the training yard on Wednesday, and deployed by Roman soldiers by the end of the campaigning season. This turned every conflict into a learning opportunity, ensuring the legion never became a relic. It remained a dynamic, evolving entity, always adding the sharpest tools to its kit, forever ensuring that the next war would not be fought with the outdated tactics of the last. Yet the legion's greatest strength was not found in a sword or a rampart, but in a symbol, in the swirling chaos of a battlefield, where vision was choked by dust and hearing was drowned by screams. A soldier's world narrowed to a single, sacred point of reference, the legion's standard. At the heart of this symbolic system stood the aquila, the eagle, crafted from silver or gold and mounted atop a tall pole. This was not a mere flag or decoration. It was the physical embodiment of the legion's soul, its divine protector, and its collective honor. To lose the aquila in battle was an unthinkable catastrophe, a spiritual wound that could disband a legion in disgrace. Its recovery, therefore, became the stuff of legend, a mission that could define an entire campaign, as emperors would mobilize armies not just to conquer territory, but to retrieve this sacred metal bird from enemy hands. This profound reverence was drilled into every recruit from his first day. He learned that the standard was the heart of the formation, the one fixed point in a moving world. His training in complex maneuvers always centered on it. He was conditioned to orient himself, to advance, and to retreat in relation to that gleaming symbol held aloft before him. In the blinding confusion of combat, when lines broke and formations dissolved, a soldier's primary instinct was not to flee, but to fight his way back toward the standard. It was the ultimate rallying point, a beacon of order in the madness. The man entrusted with carrying this sacred burden was the signifier, the standard bearer. His was a position of the highest honor, reserved for a veteran of proven courage and unwavering steadiness. In battle, he wore the pelt of a wolf, bear, or lion over his helmet and armor, a terrifying and magnificent sight that made him instantly visible. His role was one of immense personal sacrifice. He could not wield a shield effectively, for both his hands were occupied holding the heavy standard aloft. His only defense was the circle of his comrades, who were drilled to protect him with their lives. To let the signifer fall was to risk the standard itself, and so the entire unit fought as a living fortress around this human pillar. This symbolic focus performed a powerful psychological alchemy. Abstract concepts like loyalty to Rome, pride in one's legion, and the favor of the gods were all condensed into a single, tangible object they could see shining just ahead. They were not fighting for a distant senate or an emperor they might never meet. They were fighting for that eagle, for the man carrying it, and for the brothers defending it. The standard transformed duty into devotion and discipline into a kind of sacred pact. In the moment of greatest peril, a legionary did not need to understand grand strategy. He simply needed to keep his eyes on the eagle and hold his ground. The signifer, standing firm amidst the storm, was the silent conductor of this desperate symphony, his courage holding the entire melody together. To follow the standard was to remember who you were, even when everything around you screamed that you were lost. The gleaming eagle gave them a soul, but a legion's true lifeblood flowed along rutted dirt roads. For every soldier on the front line, there existed a vast, unseen network of clerks, muleteers, and quartermasters, a logistical tale that stretched all the way back to Rome. This was warfare's unglamorous backbone, and the Romans mastered it with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to sword drills. Their genius lay in understanding that an army's reach was defined not by the courage of its men, but by the reliability of its supply chain. While an enemy force might be formidable in a single battle, its staying power was often measured in the days of food its warriors carried on their backs. The Roman system, by contrast, was engineered for permanence. This logistical machinery transformed the legion from a raiding party into a permanent, grinding force of occupation. The responsibility for this immense task fell to a specialized officer, the quaestor, or more commonly, to experienced centurions and optios detached for quartermaster duty. Their training was as rigorous as any combat drill, but it focused on ledgers, geography, and animal husbandry. They learned to calculate the exact tonnage of grain required to feed a legion of 5,000 men for a month, a staggering figure that could exceed 150 tons. They mastered the logistics of moving that grain, organizing trains of hundreds of mules, each animal capable of carrying around 200 pounds. A single legion on the march might be accompanied by over 1,000 of these sturdy, sure-footed beasts along with their handlers and guards. The quartermaster's role was to know every stream along the planned route where the animals could drink, every defensible hill suitable for an overnight depot, and every local tribe that could be persuaded or compelled to provide fresh supplies. This was a continuous, high-stakes puzzle where a single miscalculation, a spoiled grain shipment, a washed-out ford, could cripple an army without a single enemy arrow being fired. To mitigate these risks, the Romans built predictability into the landscape itself. Ahead of major campaigns, they would establish a series of fortified supply depots along the intended line of advance. These were not full legions forts, but smaller, heavily guarded stockpiles of grain, salted meat, weapons, and fodder. Think of them as ancient gas stations prepositioned by a meticulous staff. A legion on campaign could thus travel lighter and faster, knowing it could replenish from these secure caches every few days. This system allowed Roman armies to operate with strategic depth that baffled their opponents. They could march deep into the forests of Germania or the deserts of Syria, far from fertile Roman provinces, and still remain a cohesive, well-fed fighting force for months or even years. Their enemies, often tribal societies whose men were also farmers, faced an impossible dilemma. They could muster a large force for a short time, but when planting or harvest season arrived, the army would simply melt away, each man returning to his vital fields. The Roman soldier had no field to return to. His only duty was the legion, and the legion's supply train ensured his duty never ended. This logistical disparity created a psychological weapon as potent as any siege ramp. A tribal chieftain might win a skirmish against a Roman column, but he would watch in despair as that same column, seemingly undiminished, fortified a camp on his land a week later, and then another a month after that. The Roman army did not need to win every battle, it just needed to stay an unshakable, permanent fact on the horizon. Its presence was a slow, constant drain, denying the enemy access to their own croplands and trade routes. The message was clear: you cannot outlast us, you cannot starve us out. We have turned the art of supply into a form of relentless, slow-burn siege warfare against entire regions. This mastery of the mundane of grain sacks and mule trains was what truly cemented conquest. It meant that where the Eagle standard marched, it did not just pass through, it put down roots, fed by an invisible river of planning and effort that flowed from the very heart of the empire. Rome's power was rooted in the soil, but its reach stretched across the water. While the empire is remembered for its legions marching along stone roads, its true strategic genius lay in mastering a second dimension, the sea. The Romans were never natural sailors like the Phoenicians or Greeks, yet they understood that to command the Mediterranean, they needed to command the waves. This led to the creation of the classes, the imperial fleet, and a specialized form of training that turned land-bound legionaries into capable amphibious troops. The ability to move an army by sea with the same disciplined efficiency as by land transformed Roman strategy from a linear advance into a multidimensional chess game. A coastal enemy could never feel safe, for the threat might not come from the land border to the north, but from the seemingly empty horizon to the south. This required a unique and dangerous drill. Legionaries, weighed down by their armor and packs, would practice embarking and disembarking from transport ships, not in the calm of a harbor, but in simulated combat conditions. Climbing down rope nets into waiting landing craft, maintaining formation on a rocking deck, and surging onto a hostile beach in good order. These were complex maneuvers where a single moment of panic or disorder could drown an entire century. The discipline forged on the parade ground was now tested on the shifting decks of the navis actuaria, the troop transports. This training meant a Roman army could appear almost anywhere with a coastline, bypassing fortified land routes and striking at the soft underbelly of a province or rival kingdom. The most famous demonstration of this naval army integration was the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era. While the clash featured the warships of Octavian and Mark Antony, the decisive elements were the legionaries fighting as marines on deck. These were not sailors, they were infantrymen applying their close-quarters combat drill to the confined, chaotic space of a warship's deck. They used their peeler as boarding pikes, their gladii for the brutal press of ship-to-ship fighting, and their large scuta to form a shield wall even on the rolling waves. Victory at Actium was not won by superior seamanship alone, but by the relentless discipline of Roman infantrymen who treated the sea as just another battlefield. This combined arms capability gave Rome an operational flexibility unseen in the ancient world. A rebellion in a distant province could be met not by a slow, exhausting overland march, but by a fleet carrying 2 full legions directly to the crisis point. The sea became a highway for supply, allowing besieging armies to be provisioned from across the empire, nullifying an enemy's hope of starving them out. The classis ensured that the Mediterranean, rather than dividing the empire, became its unifying circulatory system, with troops and grain flowing along its routes as predictably as blood through a vein. To control the land, Rome first learned to respect the sea, turning its legions into a force that could march on water. The sea could deliver a legion to any shore, but the true test of endurance was fought within the soldier's own body. A battlefield wound was a visible crisis, yet the silent, relentless drain of illness and infection claimed far more lives in ancient armies than any enemy sword. The Romans understood this brutal arithmetic, and their response was as systematic as their siegecraft. Deep within the geometric precision of every permanent fortress, behind the barracks and granaries, stood a building dedicated solely to preservation, the Valetudinarium. This was the legion's hospital, a clear statement that the state's investment in a soldier did not end when he was injured or fell ill. It was an institution of recovery, staffed by men known as medici, who combined the roles of physician, surgeon, and pharmacist. Their presence transformed the grim statistics of ancient warfare, turning a camp from a mere collection of fighters into a self-sustaining community that could heal its own. While their methods seem primitive through a modern lens, they operated with a startling degree of organization and empirical knowledge. The layout of the Valetudinarium itself was designed for efficiency and sanitation, with separate wards to isolate contagious cases, a surgical room, a pharmacy for preparing treatments, and even a courtyard for convalescents. This physical separation of the sick from the healthy within the camp walls was a revolutionary practice, a direct attack on the epidemics that could decimate a tightly packed army. The medici were not mere theorists, they were practical men trained through experience, often Greeks or individuals from the eastern provinces where medical scholarship was more advanced. Their toolkits, excavated from sites across the empire, reveal a sophisticated approach. They contained bronze scalpels, probes, forceps, and bone levers, instruments for precise field surgery. They understood the necessity of cleaning wounds, using vinegar as a disinfectant and honey for its antibacterial properties to prevent corruption. They could set broken bones with splints, perform amputations as a last resort to save a life from gangrene, and stitch torn flesh. Perhaps most importantly, this professional medical corps likely instituted a trickle-down system of knowledge. It is believed that basic first aid training was disseminated to the rank and file, teaching soldiers how to apply a field dressing, use a tourniquet, or safely move a wounded comrade from the line. This meant that immediate care did not wait for a medic to arrive. It began with the man standing right beside you. This institutional commitment to health extended far beyond the hospital's walls. It was integrated into the daily fabric of legionary life, from the reliable nutrition of the grain ration that kept men strong, to the strict camp hygiene that mandated latrines be dug downstream from water sources. The legions built aqueducts to bring fresh water into their fortresses and sophisticated drainage systems to carry waste away. This attention to the fundamentals of public health created an environment where soldiers were simply less likely to get sick in the first place. The result was a staggering strategic advantage. While a tribal host could be halved by dysentery or fever within a single campaigning season, a Roman legion could maintain its strength in the field for years. A soldier who recovered from a wound in the Valetudinarium could return to his century, his experience intact. This drastically reduced what commanders called non-combat attrition, the slow withering of an army not by the enemy but by neglect. It meant that the pressure a legion applied on a frontier was not a fleeting raid but a constant, unwavering presence. The enemy faced not just an army but a system, one that could bleed for a decade and still regenerate its strength. The Valetudinarium was more than a clinic. It was a declaration that every legionary was a renewable resource, a piece of the machine too valuable to discard. By caring for the individual soldier's body, Rome guaranteed the enduring health of the entire imperial organism. The soldier's body was healed by the Valetudinarium, but his will to fight was fueled by something far more tangible. The legion's discipline was a psychological fortress, yet its gates were unlocked with silver and land. Rome's military dominance was as much an economic engine as a martial one, a sophisticated system of compensation that transformed duty into a desirable career. At its base was the stipendium, the regular military pay. This was not a pittance or a sporadic reward. It was a reliable, documented salary issued 3 times a year. For a landless citizen from a poor family, this steady income was a lifeline, a guarantee of food, clothing, and a small measure of personal wealth that farming or day labor might never provide. It created a direct material bond between the soldier and the state, making his loyalty a matter of ongoing financial interest. But the real spark for ambition was the promise of preda, the spoils of war. After a successful siege or battle, the captured wealth, precious metals, coins, slaves, and goods was systematically gathered, tallied, and distributed according to rank and merit. A common legionary could earn a bonus worth several years of his base pay from a single rich conquest. This system was a masterstroke of motivation. It directly incentivized aggressive, successful action. A soldier knew that his personal fortune was tied to the legion's victory, making him not just a defender of Rome, but an active investor in its expansion. The centurions and commanders receiving larger shares were equally driven to seek out lucrative campaigns. This turned the army into a self-propelling force of acquisition, where collective success translated into individual prosperity. The ultimate reward, however, lay at the end of the road. After 25 years of arduous service, a legionary who received an honorable discharge was granted a premia militiae, a retirement pension. For most of the imperial era, this took the form of a generous plot of land, typically in a frontier province that needed settling. This was the crowning piece of the economic package, a transformational promise. The landless recruit who joined as a young man could now retire as a propertied veteran, a respected pillar of a new Roman community. He had a farm, status, and a future secured by the empire he helped build. This comprehensive economic structure, reliable pay, the chance for plunder, and the certainty of a pension did something revolutionary. It made soldiering a legitimate and attractive profession for generations of Romans. It guaranteed a steady stream of volunteers, ending the reliance on reluctant conscripts and fostering that essential long service mentality. The man who trained beside you for a decade was not counting the days until he could go home to his farm. He was building a shared future within the military system itself. His personal ambition for security, wealth, and legacy became perfectly aligned with the empire's need for conquest and stability. He fought for Rome, yes, but in a very real sense, he fought for the deed to his own land, for the silver in his strongbox, and for the honorable retirement he had been promised. The legion was not just an army, it was the most reliable corporation in the ancient world, and every soldier held a share. A system built on such rigid discipline might seem brittle, yet its true genius was a hidden flexibility. The Roman military machine possessed an extraordinary capacity to learn, not from its easy victories, but from its most shattering defeats. 2 names echo through history as symbols of catastrophic failure: Cannae and Teutoburg. Each represented a moment when the legionary system was broken, and from the wreckage of each, Rome engineered a stronger version of itself. This institutional memory, this ability to transform trauma into a textbook, became the ultimate source of its resilience. The first great teacher was Hannibal Barca at Cannae in the year 216 before the Common Era. On a dusty Italian plain, the Carthaginian general executed a tactical masterpiece, using his cavalry to encircle and trap a massive Roman army nearly twice the size of his own. The legions were packed so tightly they could not wield their swords, and the slaughter that followed was one of the worst single-day military losses in all of ancient history. Tens of thousands of Roman citizens and allies fell. In the immediate aftermath, the shock was paralyzing, but Rome did not collapse. Instead, its commanders began a ruthless autopsy of the disaster. The blunt, head-on assault of the old manipular legions had been outmaneuvered by a more agile enemy. The response was not to abandon the legion, but to refine it. The lessons of Canny accelerated the adoption of the cohort as the primary tactical unit. This block of 480 men was more flexible than the older maniples, easier to maneuver, and better able to withstand the pressure of encirclement. Commanders like Scipio Africanus, who would eventually defeat Hannibal, studied the Carthaginians' methods and adapted them, using maneuver and intelligence as deftly as brute force. The defeat became a masterclass in operational art, studied by generations of Roman officers. It taught them that discipline alone was not enough. It had to be paired with strategic cunning. The ghost of Canny ensured that Roman generals respected the possibility of envelopment and trained their armies to respond to it, hardening the system against its own previous weaknesses. The second, more profound lesson came from the dark soil of Germania in the year 9 of the Common Era. Here, the teacher was not a brilliant general on an open field, but the forest itself. The Roman commander Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 veteran legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, on a routine march through the dense, unfamiliar Teutoburg forest. They were ambushed by Germanic tribesmen led by Arminius, a chieftain who had once served in Rome's own auxiliary forces. Over several days of brutal, close quarters fighting in the rain and mud, the entire force was annihilated. The loss was more than tactical, it was existential. 3 eagles, the sacred soul of 3 legions, were captured. The news reportedly shattered Emperor Augustus, who is said to have wandered his palace crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." This was not just a military defeat, it was a failure of Roman understanding. The disaster forced a fundamental strategic rethink. The empire had reached its logistical and cultural limit. The dense, trackless forests of Germania, where the legion's formations and engineering skills were neutralized, could not be held by the standard playbook. In the aftermath, Rome's frontier policy underwent a dramatic shift. Aggressive expansion beyond the Rhine River largely ceased. Instead, the empire solidified its existing borders, investing in a network of fortified lines, watchtowers, and client relationships with tribes along the frontier. The legions became a permanent, defensive garrison force in these regions, their training now incorporating lessons on fighting in broken, wooded terrain. The lost legions were never reconstituted, their numbers retired in disgrace, a permanent memorial to the cost of overreach. The trauma of Teutoburg taught Rome to define its limits, to understand that some landscapes could not be conquered by the legion's template, only contained. This painful wisdom granted the empire centuries more of stability by preventing endless, draining wars of attrition in unconquerable lands. Together, these 2 catastrophes bookend the Roman military mind. Canny taught how to fight better on the battlefield. Teutoburg taught where not to fight at all. Both lessons were codified, passed down through the Centurion, and woven into the fabric of military doctrine. This is the hallmark of a system built to last, not a perfect machine that never fails, but a learning organism that uses its own scars as a map for survival. The true test of discipline is not whether you can avoid a fall, but whether you can study the ground that tripped you and teach every soldier who comes after how to walk more surely. The legions were the unbreakable core, but the empire's true reach was multiplied by a second army marching beside them. These were the auxilia, the allied forces, a diverse collection of non-citizen soldiers recruited from every corner of the Roman world. They were specialists, masters of their own homeland's way of war, and their integration into the military machine granted Rome a tactical flexibility no single culture could ever achieve. While the legionary trained for the brutal press of the shield wall, the auxiliary brought the skills that softened the enemy before that wall ever made contact. The system was a masterpiece of pragmatic absorption, turning potential rivals into indispensable partners. Imagine a Roman commander facing a new threat on the frontier, perhaps swift horse archers from the eastern steppes. His heavy infantry legions, for all their discipline, could not chase down such a fleeting foe. But within his own army, he had an answer, a unit of Syrian archers, raised from a region where the composite bow was a cultural art form. These men could unleash a storm of arrows to disrupt the enemy's hit-and-run tactics, something no legionary cohort was trained to do. This was the auxiliaries' purpose, to fill the gaps in the Roman way of fighting with their own native excellence. The auxilia were organized into distinct regiments, each specializing in a particular mode of combat. The most prestigious were the alii, the cavalry wings. Rome's early cavalry was often its weakest link, but by recruiting expert horsemen from places like Gaul, Iberia, and later, the plains of North Africa, they built a formidable mounted force. A Gallic cavalryman, for instance, brought a fearless, aggressive style perfect for shock charges, while a Numidian horseman from Africa was a master of skirmishing and reconnaissance, able to harass an enemy for days with javelins. Alongside the cavalry were cohorts of infantry specialists, like the famed Balearic slingers from the islands off Spain. A Balearic soldier could hurl a lead bullet with such force and accuracy it could fracture bone at over 100 yards, a terrifying capability for breaking up enemy formations before the main lines clashed. There were Cretan archers whose bows had a longer range and greater punch than the standard infantry's, and there were light infantry skirmishers from Thrace, armed with javelins and small shields, perfect for fighting in rough, wooded terrain where the legion's tight formations would falter. Each of these units trained and fought in their traditional manner, using the weapons and tactics of their ancestors. A Syrian archer did not drill with a gladius on a wooden post. He practiced the draw and release of his powerful composite bow, a weapon crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that required immense strength to use effectively. But this preservation of native skill came with a crucial Roman overlay, integration into a unified command structure. An auxiliary cohort was not an independent warband, it was a standardized unit within the Roman army. It had its own Roman officers, often a prefect or tribune, who reported up the chain of command to the legion's legate. It built and occupied its own section of the legionary fortress, following the same camp-building drills. It marched to the same trumpet calls and was subject to the same overarching discipline, the Disciplina Romana. This hybrid system was brilliantly effective. It allowed Rome to leverage specialized talents without having to invent them from scratch, while ensuring those talents were directed toward Roman strategic goals. The auxiliary soldier fought in his own way, but always as part of the Roman plan. This created a combined arms force of stunning versatility. A typical battle array might see Gallic cavalry on the flanks, Syrian archers providing covering fire from the rear, Balearic slingers skirmishing in front, and Thracian light infantry guarding the army's vulnerable edges, all working in concert to channel the enemy toward the waiting wall of legionary heavy infantry. The enemy faced not a monolithic Roman style, but a symphony of violence where every instrument played a different, complementary part. For the men who served in the auxilia, the rewards were transformative and deliberately designed to foster loyalty. While they received pay slightly less than a legionary, they were offered something even more valuable, the ultimate prize of Roman citizenship. After 25 years of honorable service, an auxiliary veteran was granted a formal diploma, a bronze tablet inscribed with his name and the emperor's decree, which conferred full Roman citizenship upon him, his children, and his descendants. This was not a trivial piece of paper, it was a legal and social passport. It meant his family could own land under Roman law, marry Roman citizens, and enjoy the protections of the Roman legal system. For a young man from a conquered tribe in Britannia or Germania, this was a staggering opportunity, a chance to literally change the destiny of his bloodline. The promise of this diploma hung over every march, every watch, every battle. It incentivized not just service, but exemplary service, as a dishonorable discharge would void this golden promise. This policy was a stroke of political genius. It turned military service into the primary engine of cultural assimilation. Generation by generation, the most martial and ambitious young men from the provinces were drawn into the Roman system, and after a lifetime of service, they emerged as loyal Roman citizens, often settled in frontier communities that helped stabilize the very regions they were once recruited from. The empire did not just conquer with the sword, it recruited with the promise of belonging. The auxiliary system reveals the deepest secret of Roman military longevity, its ability to co-opt and integrate. It was a global talent search, constantly refreshing the army's tactical playbook with the best ideas from 100 different cultures. The legion provided the steady, disciplined core, but the auxilia provided the adaptable, specialized limbs that allowed that core to operate anywhere against anyone. This structure meant the Roman army was never static. It was a learning network. A fighting style encountered in Britannia one year could be countered by auxiliaries recruited from a region that had mastered a similar style a decade later. The empire harnessed the entire martial energy of its conquered peoples, channeling it outward to conquer still more. In doing so, it created something unprecedented. A truly multicultural, professional military where a Germanic tribesman, a Syrian archer, and an Italian legionary could stand in the same battle line, each contributing their unique skill toward a common Roman victory. The Eagle Standard led them all, but the path to its foot was walked by many different kinds of soldier, united by a system that offered them a share in the very world they were ordered to defend. The promise of citizenship might await at the end of a career, but each day began with a trumpet blast at dawn. Life inside the fortress walls was governed by a relentless, unchanging rhythm, a cycle of duty designed to make war feel like a brief interruption. Even in the deepest peacetime, on a quiet frontier with no enemy in sight, the training never stopped. A legionary's day was a meticulously scheduled exercise in perpetual readiness, where the line between routine and combat drill was deliberately blurred. The first hours after sunrise were always dedicated to weapons practice. The air in the training yard would fill with the familiar thud of wooden swords against posts and the clatter of practice shields, as centuries drilled through the same maneuvers they had performed 1,000 times before. This was not about learning something new. It was about preserving the sharp, automatic edge of a skill that could rust from disuse faster than any iron blade. Following this, the soldiers would assemble for the morning inspection, standing at attention as their Centurion moved down the line, his vine staff tapping lightly on a poorly polished breastplate or a loosely fastened strap. Every piece of equipment, from the hobnailed soles of their sandals to the crest of their helmet, had to meet an immaculate standard. This daily scrutiny reinforced a simple truth: your gear was not your property. It was a loan from the Roman state, and its condition reflected your respect for the entire system. The afternoon shifted from martial skill to manual labor, the so-called fatigue duties that were the unglamorous backbone of garrison life. A soldier might be assigned to clean the barracks, scour the communal latrines, repair a section of the fortress wall, or work in the fabrica, the camp's workshop, helping to forge new nails or repair broken cartwheels. He might haul water from the aqueduct, grind grain for the next day's bread, or stand a 4-hour watch on the ramparts, scanning an empty landscape for a threat that almost never came. This constant physical work served multiple masters. It prevented the idleness that breeds boredom and mischief in any confined group. It maintained the camp's infrastructure, making the legion self-sufficient. But most importantly, it reinforced discipline as a constant state of being, not just a mode for battle. The message was ingrained through action. there was no separation between the soldier and the laborer, between the warrior and the engineer. The same hands that wielded a gladius would also wield a shovel, a hammer, or a broom. This fusion of roles meant the army was never a passive burden on the province it occupied. It was a productive, building force even at rest. As the sun began to lower, the trumpet would sound again, calling the men back to the field for more drill. Often this was the long march, the relentless practice of moving in formation with full kit, or rehearsing the complex evolutions of the testudo or the battle line. The day would end as it began, with the body exhausted and the mind focused on the collective, not the individual. There was no off-season for a legionary, no period where he could hang up his armor and forget his training. Readiness was a perpetual condition, a fire that had to be stoked every single day. This unending daily grind was the hidden engine of the Roman strategic deterrent. A neighboring tribe or rival kingdom knew that the legion in the fortress over the hill was not hibernating. It was awake, sharp, and at full strength every morning. The sight of those perfectly aligned columns drilling on the plain, the sound of their coordinated shouts, the evidence of their ever-improving fortifications, all communicated a simple, powerful fact. This force could march out at a moment's notice, and it would be as effective tomorrow as it was in the last campaign a decade ago. The true power of Rome was not just in its ability to fight a war, but in its terrifying capacity to exist forever in a state of poised and practiced peace. This daily rhythm of readiness echoed from one corner of the empire to the other, a testament to a system built for infinite replication. Wherever the eagle standard was planted, a new, identical world of order would rise from the earth. The Roman military did not just build forts, it manufactured a universal culture of discipline, exporting its blueprint for power to every conquered shore. From the rain-swept highlands of Britannia to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the empire stamped the landscape with a single, unmistakable pattern. A soldier transferred from a legion in Spain to a frontier post in Dacia would find himself on a drill field of identical dimensions, responding to the same trumpet calls and falling into a testudo formation with men whose native tongue he did not share. This was not an accident, it was the ultimate expression of Roman organizational genius. The standardization of military infrastructure created a seamless, interchangeable army. A legion raised in North Africa could march north and slot perfectly into the battle line alongside a legion from the Danube because they were not just allies, they were identical components from the same factory. They shared the same chain of command, the same hand signals, the same punishing march pace, and the same geometric layout for their nightly camp. This universality turned the entire empire into a single, vast training ground. For the local young men recruited into the auxilia, or, later, even the legions, this military machine was their first and most profound teacher in the art of being Roman. The recruit from a Celtic tribe in Gaul or a Berber community in North Africa entered a world where Latin was the language of command, where Roman law dictated justice within the camp, and where the calendar was marked by festivals to Roman gods. The process of Romanization did not begin in a school or a forum. It began on the parade ground. Through the relentless repetition of drill, he internalized Roman values, order, obedience, and collective identity. He learned to measure distance in Roman miles, to tell time by the watchwords called in Latin, and to understand his place within a vast, impersonal hierarchy. The army's culture was a powerful solvent, breaking down tribal loyalties and reforming a new, shared identity centered on the legion and the empire it served. The camp was more than a barracks, it was a classroom where a diverse array of peoples were molded into a homogeneous Roman instrument. They ate Roman food, followed Roman hygiene practices, and celebrated Roman victories. Upon retirement, these veterans, now fluent in the language and customs of their rulers, were often settled in colonies that became nuclei of Roman culture in the provinces. They built villas in the Roman style, participated in local government under Roman law, and raised families who saw themselves as Roman. In this way, the legionary fortress acted as the primary engine of cultural diffusion. It was a self-contained capsule of Roman life dropped into the heart of foreign territory, radiating its influence outward. The sword secured the land, but it was the daily routine of the camp, the shared hardship of the march, and the common language of the drill field that truly cemented the conquest, transforming strangers into citizens of a single, sprawling world. But the very perfection of this military machine contained the seeds of its own vulnerability. A system engineered for limitless expansion and rigid control was ultimately bound by the same laws of physics and human nature that govern all empires. Its legendary efficiency was not a magical quality. It was a delicate balance, a complex equation that required constant, massive inputs to maintain its output. The legions could conquer the world, but they could not conquer the slow, corrosive pressures of time, distance, and internal decay. Their strength was a towering edifice built on a foundation of three non-negotiable pillars: a robust economy to fund it, a steady stream of loyal citizens to fill its ranks, and a stable central authority to direct its immense power. When these pillars began to crack, the entire military structure, for all its discipline, began to warp under the strain. The first and most relentless pressure was economic. The professional army was breathtakingly expensive. The cost of paying, feeding, equipping, and pensioning off hundreds of thousands of men across 3 continents was a constant drain on the imperial treasury. For centuries, this was sustainable, funded by the plunder of new conquests and the efficient taxation of prosperous provinces. But as the empire's borders solidified and expansion slowed, the river of new wealth dwindled to a trickle. The army became a permanent, gargantuan maintenance cost rather than a profit center. To meet these obligations, emperors resorted to debasing the currency, reducing the silver content in coins to stretch the treasury further. This led to rampant inflation, eroding the real value of a soldier's pay. A legionary who once dreamed of a prosperous retirement now found his salary buying less and less. This economic squeeze created deep-seated resentment and made the army restless, its loyalty increasingly for sale to the highest bidder. The state's promise, the very bedrock of the professional soldier's contract, was being broken by financial reality. Simultaneously, the demographic foundation of the army was shifting. The traditional pool of Italian citizen recruits, the core of the early legions, was shrinking. Centuries of warfare and the allure of life in the capital had depleted the countryside. To fill the ranks, Rome was forced to look further afield, recruiting heavily from the frontier provinces. These new soldiers, often from recently conquered regions, had a different relationship with the idea of Rome. Their primary loyalty was not to an abstract concept of the Republic or the Emperor in a distant city, but to their immediate commander, the general who paid them, led them to victory, and promised them the spoils that the struggling central treasury could not. The army was becoming less Roman in its composition and, consequently, in its political allegiance. This shift in loyalty created a dangerous paradox. The very training that forged unbreakable units also forged unbreakable bonds between soldiers and their generals. A successful commander, spending years on campaign with his legions, became the direct source of their pay, their plunder, and their sense of honor. The Centurion's vine staff enforced discipline, but it was the general's charisma and success that inspired devotion. The legions, trained to obey without question, began to transfer their ultimate obedience from the distant state to the tangible leader in their midst. The army, created as a tool of the empire, was becoming a political kingmaker. Ambitious generals discovered they could use the loyalty of their battle-hardened troops as leverage, marching on Rome itself to claim the imperial purple. The 3rd century crisis saw a dizzying parade of so-called barracks emperors, military men proclaimed by their own soldiers, ruling briefly and often meeting violent ends at the hands of the next army-backed usurper. The professional military, designed to impose order, had become a primary source of profound disorder. The cost of maintaining it bankrupted the state, the need to staff it changed its cultural heart, and the loyalty it bred became a weapon turned inward. This was the tragic flaw in an otherwise brilliant system. It was too effective at creating power, and that power, once created, demanded to be fed and would follow its own hunger. The machine built to last 1,000 years found that its greatest enemy was not the barbarian at the gate, but the inevitable entropy within its own perfect, demanding design. The shadow of the Legion is longer than we often realize, stretching across 2,000 years to fall upon the parade grounds and staff colleges of today. While the Gladius and the Lorica Segmentata are museum pieces, the underlying principles that animated the Roman military machine did not fade with the empire. They were absorbed, adapted, and refined, becoming the invisible blueprint for modern professional armies. The echoes are not in the weapons, but in the mindset. The relentless pursuit of standardization, for instance, is a direct inheritance. A Roman recruit in Britannia and one in Syria learned from the same manual, built identical camps, and responded to the same command. This universal template ensured seamless interoperability, a concept any modern military alliance, from NATO to multinational coalitions, depends upon utterly. A soldier from one nation can integrate with allies because they share standardized procedures, communication protocols, and tactical doctrines, a direct descendant of Rome's imperial playbook. The Centurion's legacy is perhaps the most profound. The modern military's backbone is not its generals, but its professional non-commissioned officer corps, the sergeants and warrant officers. Like the Centurion with his vine staff, these are the leaders who live with their troops, translate high-level orders into actionable tasks, and enforce the daily discipline that makes an army function. They are the keepers of tradition and the teachers of skill, promoted from within based on proven merit and experience. This system of decentralized, empowered leadership, where a seasoned professional maintains unit cohesion and effectiveness, is a Roman invention that has never been improved upon. The value of disciplina, that blend of obedience, pride, and collective responsibility, remains the bedrock of military ethos. Modern basic training, for all its technological advancements, still seeks to achieve what the Roman drill yard did, to break down individual identity and rebuild it as part of a team where the unit's success matters more than personal glory. Furthermore, the Roman ideal of the soldier-engineer never disappeared. Today's militaries are filled with combat engineers, logistical specialists, and communications experts. The ability to build, repair, and innovate in the field, to make any environment operable, is a core competency. When a modern army constructs a forward operating base with airfields, power grids, and water purification systems in a matter of weeks, it is executing the same principle that drove a legion to build a fortified city overnight, just with different tools. The logistical planning that kept legions fed across continents finds its parallel in the global supply chains that sustain contemporary forces, where the movement of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts is calculated with computer-aided precision, but serves the same ancient goal: to keep the fighting force intact and operational far from home. This enduring relevance is why Roman campaigns are still pored over in war colleges from West Point to Sandhurst. The strategies of Julius Caesar, the operational mobility of commanders like Scipio, and the catastrophic lessons of Teutoburg are not dusty history. They are case studies in human conflict, geography, and organizational limits. Students dissect the Battle of Cannae to understand the double envelopment, and they study the siege of Masada to grasp the psychological impact of relentless engineering. The Romans provided a 500-year laboratory on how to project power, administer conquest, and ultimately how a system can become a victim of its own logistical and political weight. They teach that tactics win battles, but logistics and administration win wars, a lesson every modern general must learn. In the end, the Legion stands as history's most complete case study in building a complex, resilient organization. It demonstrates that enduring power is not about a single technological advantage or a moment of genius, but about systems, standardization, and the slow, hard work of instilling a shared culture of discipline. The methods forged on the fields of ancient Italy speak to a fundamental truth about human endeavor on a large scale, that order is not natural. It is manufactured through relentless repetition, clear incentive, and unwavering standards. When we look at the structures that shape our world today, from corporations to governments, we are often seeing variations on a theme first written in the camp layouts and training manuals of the Roman legions. Their world is gone, but the architecture of their power remains, a silent testament to the fact that the most formidable walls are not made of stone, but of habit, hierarchy, and a common purpose drilled into the bone. The brutal efficiency of the Roman legions was never a gift of nature, but a triumph of human design. It was a system meticulously engineered, where every element, from the daily grind of the march to the sacred gleam of the eagle, served a single purpose: to forge the individual into an unbreakable part of a greater whole. This was not a machine that ran on blind obedience alone. It operated on a sophisticated balance of pressures and promises. Harsh discipline was counterweighted by the tangible reward of silver and land. Constant adaptation to new enemies and landscapes was anchored by unwavering traditions of drill and command. The individual skill of the swordsman was always secondary to the unshakable cohesion of the century. This delicate equilibrium is what allowed the legions to build an empire that spanned continents and endured for centuries. Their legacy is far more than a collection of battles won. It is a masterclass in building complex, resilient organizations. The principles they codified, standardization, merit-based leadership, logistical foresight, and the cultivation of a shared culture, form a blueprint for collective power that echoes far beyond the ancient world. As we look at the challenges of coordination and scale in our own time, from global enterprises to civic institutions, the Roman model offers a timeless reflection. It asks us what can be achieved when individual effort is channeled through a clear, practiced, and purposeful structure. If this exploration into the heart of ancient discipline resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the systems that shaped history. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which aspect of the legionary's world, from the weight of his pack to the promise of his retirement, do you find most compelling?